Hello, everyone. I'm Maurice Samuels, the director of the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to our Benjamin and Barbara Zucker lecture series. I'm pretty sure this is our first lecture on the topic of antisemitism in South America. The plan for today will be that I will introduce the speaker. He'll talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. Please submit your questions at any time during the lecture using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and I will ask them. The chat function is disabled, so don't use that. Today's speaker, Emmanuel Kahan, holds a PhD in History and Memory Studies from the National University of La Plata, Buenos Aires, and he's a researcher at the National Council for Scientific and Technological Research, CONICET, in Argentina. He's also a professor in the History Department at the National University of La Plata and teaches postgraduate courses in different higher education institutions throughout Argentina. He's the academic coordinator of the Jewish Studies program at the Institute for Economic and Social Development in Buenos Aires, as well as the education program for teachers on the Holocaust and other 20th century genocides within the National Plan for Teachers Education in Argentina. He's also an affiliated researcher at the Center for Advanced Genocide Research at the Shoah Foundation at USC. He's the author of several books in Spanish on topics ranging from the Jewish experience during Argentina's military dictatorship to the Israel-Palestine conflict in Argentina, as well as one book in English, Memories That Lie a Little, published by Brill in 2018. In 2013, he received the American Jewish Studies Association's Best Dissertation Award, and in 2015, he was awarded the Scientific Work Prize by the National University of La Plata. The title of his talk today is Antisemitism in Argentina, Historical Experience, Public Debate, and Changing Meanings. Please join me in welcoming Emmanuel.
Thank you, Maurice Samuels. Thank you, everybody, for being here and coming for listening to me. I am from Argentina. English is not my language, so I apologize for some mistakes I'm going to do. I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides to present. So please, I think that now we are seeing the presentation. Some years ago, in the framework of a conference on Latin American Jewish studies, I witnessed a series of debates about how to approach the Jewish experience in our region. In one of the exchanges, a researcher working from abroad on the experience of Jewish life in Argentina warned, quote, "However, reviews the bibliography on the history of Argentinian Jewish community could conclude that the life of Jews in the country, since they wake up until they go back to sleep, it's an ordeal. Antisemitism is a widespread practice that threatens their existence. However, those of us who know the development of institutional life as well as unaffiliated Jews, we know that this is not the case," end of quote. With a bit of grace, this statement challenged one of the perspectives that had been central to the development and legitimization of fields of Jewish studies itself. Research on antisemitism in my country had revealed a concrete and significant experience of the Jewish life in Argentina, but, in turn, they had cemented a distorted image about the integration of Jews into political, social, economic, and cultural life in my country. A contemporary look at antisemitism in my country could not fail to notice at least three dimensions. In the first place, its condition as a modern historical experience that, even when it is a global phenomenon, has situated imprints. Second, the reception, use, and circulations of antisemitism in Argentina has particular characteristics, a long history that mobilizes a wide group of actors and that materializes in a series of events of criminal scopes: the tragic week in 1919, the closure of Jewish schools during the 30s, the attacks, persecutions, and murders promoted by right-wing Catholic nationalist organizations in the 50s and 60s, the special treatment of the Jewish detained during the last dictatorship, and finally, the terrorist attack against the Israelite Mutual Association of Argentina, AMIA, in 1994. Third, the formation, as a consequence of the foregoing, of a wide and diverse series of organizations that devote themselves at each time to denouncing anti-Semitic speeches and practices. The course of these organizations can be revealing. At times, their strategies for denouncing anti-Semitism were one of the engines of recognition in the public space of the uniqueness of the Jewish experience in the country. But at the same time, they were able to hold a speech confronting the victims of the persecutions against them. These presentations aim to problematize these last two dimensions through a series of precise references based on the existing bibliographic review and the survey of documents resulting from my research on the Buenos Aires police intelligence reports and the consultation of collections on the experience of life Jewish during the last military dictatorship. The work of Daniel Bovich investigates the origin of an anti-Semitic narrative since the end of the 19th century among actors ascribed to Argentine Catholic nationalism. This study let us know the effects that these early representations had on the construction of an enemy within the nationalist discourse that had its heyday between 1932 and 1943. The appearance of these ideas and proposals around the Jewish question accompanied the process of origin and consolidation of a nationalist discourse of a restrictive and authoritarian type, in opposition to the liberal and integrating discourse that the ruling classes, the elites, had in the last third of the 19th century. This nationalist discourse had strong links with the Catholic Church and with sectors of the Argentine armed forces that would link the idea of nationality to the Catholic religion. The reception of the Dreyfus affair, at the end of the 19th century, was a starting point around the dissemination of conspiracy theories about Jewish by Argentine Catholicism. It will be on the characterization of the myth of the war Jewish conspiracy that the common denominator of Argentinian restrictive nationalism was consecrated. This theory made it possible to articulate in the same speech the figure of particular enemy, the Jews, the attacks on liberal democracy, and the denunciation of the communist danger as well as of English imperialism. Although the effects of this speech around mass mobilization proved limited, quote, their recurring use and the political and literary works that they inspired, their use in the political speeches and as an electoral weapon, the fact that they have circulated in the forces' armies, and above all, the violent practices that it inspired, show that its influence is far from being marginal, end of quote. These narratives accompany a series of practices that prove ominous for Jews in Argentina. The tragic week in 1919, considered the first pogrom in South America, left an uncertain toll of victims and the consecration of the figure of the Russian, the Jews, as a political agitator. The massacre against the Jews in Balvanera neighborhood took place in the context of the repression of the Bacena factory strike. The repression of the Jewish quarter of Buenos Aires was justified by deeply rooted belief among the elites and the petit bourgeois about the Jewish character of the revolution that were taking place in Europe and, from now on, the incipient union of Soviet socialistic republics. Antisemitism will constitute since then and at least until 80s and 90s, one of the ideological supports of conservative, nationalist, and Catholic sectors in my country. However, not all nationalists, conservatives, and Catholics support anti-Semitism, but as the authors who have dedicated themselves to the study of right-wing organizations warn, narratives of hatred towards Jews were found widespread within this universe of programmatic perspectives. Its weight among the elites and state officials in various governments was marking the pulse of a series of provisions tending to restrict the activities of the various Jewish organizations, as well as to homogenize the population in relation to Catholic, Apostolic, and Roman worship. In this sense, the closure of the Jewish working class schools during the 30s, or the introduction of the compulsory teaching of Catholic religion with the military government in 1943 may be illustrative of how this imprint operated. At this point, it's necessary to replace one of the classic debates both in the field of political representations as well as among historians, the allegedly anti-Semitic character of Peronism. It is a controversy that, as the works of Andrés Bishop point out, was contemporary to the emergence of the movement led by Juan Domingo Perón. His trajectory linked to nationalist sectors that declared themselves neutral during the development of the Second World War, associated the figure of General Perón with European fascism. Since then, a recurring narrative has been structured that tends to represent Peronism as a kind of Creole Nazism. However, the works of Ronan Rain have tried to show that the expansion of citizenship rights enshrinement by the Peronist regime also had positive impact on the Jewish who inhabiting the country. Their works show that the government led by Perón did not promote any measures against the Jews and was even very attentive to the demands made by the community leaders in favor of, for example, facilitating the entry of Holocaust survivors or regularizing their citizenship status, recognizing the State of Israel, or censoring anti-Semitic statements published by nationalist leaders. However, and even for the empirical evidence presented by Rain's works allowed to corroborate his hypothesis, the perspective presented, among others, by Juan Luis Besoki, work on the Peronist right cannot be neglected. The heterogeneous character Peronism and its broad social, programmatic, and ideological base sheltered various sectors of Catholic and right-wing nationalists that were deeply anti-Semitic. The period after Peronism will register an increase of its circulation of anti-Semitic speech, threats, and practices. Leonardo Segman produced one of the most prominent pioneering and systematic volumes on anti-Semitism during this period, highlighting some of the central features during the 60s and 70s. First, a continuing narrative could be identified upholding the ideological prejudice of previous decades. The Jews were both the promoters of social revolution and financial speculation, but to which was added the accusation of double loyalty. After the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, the nationalist organization questioned the identification, solidarity, and financing campaigns that various Jewish organizations and prominent personalities developed to support the new state. Organizations such as Movimiento Nacionalista Tacuara and Guardia Restauradora Nacionalista were the spearhead of a series of campaigns that produced widespread fear among Jewish organizations and political activists. Different attacks against Edgardo Trilnik in 1960, Graciela Sirota in 1962, and the murder of Raúl Alterman in 1964, among the most prominent, are illustrative not only of the anti-Semitic escalation of those years, but also of the process of radicalization of political violence that would characterize subsequent years in Argentina. This context must take into account the reception of the Arab-Israeli conflict that mobilized a broader set of factors and would give new and changing arguments to the discourse against Jews during the period. If during this first half of the 60s, the accusation of double loyalty would have the greatest impact, after the Six-Day War in 1967, the criticism would be placed on the imperialist character of Israel in the Middle East. This dimension, however, is complex. Not all the actors and organizations that denounce the Israeli territorial expansion in the war context can be described as anti-Semitic, but many others took advantage of the climate of rejection of the war to legitimize in this public space their positions against the Jews. In turn, returning to Segman's work, one of the most outstanding aspects of his analysis is that he indicates that the spiral of anti-Semitic violence did not necessarily respond to the characteristic of the political and government regimes of the period. What does this mean? That although there has been a tendency to think that dictatorships were fertile ground for the emergence of the anti-Semitic narratives and practice, the detailed study of the proliferation of threats and attacks shows that their increase was during the terms of democratic governments from 1958 to 1966 and from 1973 to 1976. In particular, this last period was very profuse in public demonstration of rejection of the Jews. Dispute within the ruling party during the third term promote a series of narratives questioning the representation of Jews and their influences in the spheres of government, the business world, the cultural and intellectual field, and political militancy. Following the death of Juan Domingo Perón in 1974, for example, his Minister of Social Welfare, José López Rega, deployed a public and virulent campaign against the Minister of Finances, José Berhelbal, which was largely based on his status as a Jew. The presence of José Helbar in the Ministry of Economy during the administrations of Cámpora and Perón had been the cause of accusations by the right-wing nationalist organizations about the Jewish infiltrations in power and in Peronism. In the same context, two episodes related to the conflict in the Middle East took place with as during the Six-Day War, once again precipitated the question of Israel and Zionism in the public debate. The Yom Kippur War in 1973, and the declaration of the United Nations organizations equating Zionism as a kind of racism in 1975. The reception of both events served antagonist sectors of the local political scene, on the right and on the left, to challenge those who identified themselves as Jews, incorporating into the rhetoric of the war Jewish plot the accusation about the colonial dimension of Israel in the context of the Cold War. In this sense, the period characterized by radicalization of political violence has its correlate in the prejudice against the Jews of many of the political organizations that acted in those years. The military dictatorship inaugurated on March 24, 1976, was characterized, unlike the other dictatorial regimes that took place in Argentina during the 20th century, by a widespread repressive policy whose balance was 30,000 disappeared people, 500 appropriate children, and a significant number of exiles and political prisoners. The Never Again report, prepared by the National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons, la CONADEP, and the report Nunca Más, promoted by the democratic government of Raúl Alfonsín, established that the greatest number of victims had concentrated on certain strata of society: young people, workers, professionals, leaders, politicians, and trade unions. And that among the universe of affect there was, in addition, a special treatment on the part of the perpetrators towards the individuals who were identified as Jews. This representation of Jews as a special victim of the last military dictatorship was forged early and contemporaneously with the authoritarian regime in 1976. On September 28, 1976, Bart Levinson, representative of the Anti-Defamation League of the B'nai B'rith from Latin America, presented his testimony before a commission of the Chamber of Deputies of the United States of America on Human Rights in Argentina. During his statement, he pointed out the large number of Nazi publications that circulate in Argentina, and also allowed to the fact that several deaths and in terrorist attacks and of people who have disappeared were the Jewish descent. Levinson's pronouncement started controversy around who had legitimacy to denounce what was happening and to what extent anti-Semitism was a component of the policies that the dictatorial regime carried out in the so-called fight against subversion. The first voice that would be raised against the representative of the Anti-Defamation League would be that of a journalist who would later recognize himself as a victim of repression, Jacobo Timerman. However, was the director of La Opinión will send a letter to North American Senator Donald Fraser on October 1, 1976, in his capacity as chairman of the subcommittee that deals with the issue of human rights in my country, holding a different view of the declaration of Levinson. Quote, "My newspaper, La Opinión, had dealt with this problem, human rights, at all times, trying to do so objectively, without partiality, concerned about the human rights of all the country's inhabitants. In the same spirit, I feel obligated to point out to you the danger of hearing partial testimonies, which I believe is happening in that subcommittee. La Opinión has condemned all violence and, on several occasions, has stressed that condemning only one of the extremes, be it terrorism from the left or from the right, means being an accomplice of the other extreme. This leads me, dear Mr. Fraser, to ask you to be invited to testify before that subcommission, in the conviction that my testimony will serve to understand the human rights of the entire Argentina population without exclusions, and to prevent an unnecessary deterioration of relations between our two countries. End of quote. Timmermans' request would be paradoxical. He would classify years later as collaborators those who had the same attitude or refused to consider the nature of their arrest as a part of an anti-Semitic campaign by the military dictatorship. However, the controversy as a result of Levinson's statement shows that the Jewish question was a sensitive vector of international complaints about human rights violations in our country. The analysis of documents found allow us to identify two distinctive forms of manifestations of anti-Semitism in the dictatorial period, one of a public nature and the other of a clandestine. While the first was characterized by the commercial dissemination of libel against Jews, threats and attacks against community institutions, and even the official attempt to impose the compulsory teaching of the Catholic religion in public education, the second materialized more diffuse. The anti-Semitism of the clandestine order refers to the ways in which the treatment of the Jews was administered in the clandestine detention centers and the various penitentiary units where the political prisoners were housed under the disposition of the national executive power. In this sense, it could be noted that the public anti-Semitism was one of the central concerns that continued to mobilize the authorities of the Argentinian Jewish community and that obtained positive response from the dictatorial authorities. Editorials were closed, numbers were seized, and anti-Semitic books from stores for sale to the public. Rabbis were incorporated into television programming closures, the Holocaust series was broadcast, and so on. However, the scope for action around anti-Semitism of the clandestine order proved narrow and not very permeable for the representatives of institutions of the Jewish community. The centrality that the issue of a special treatment of Jews had in the period of democratic recovery and the debates around the identification of the crimes of the dictatorships with the Holocaust can be weighed by the effect they had on actors of nationalist rights. As the work of Jorge Saborido and Matthias Grinspoon show, the first years of democracy replenished in the public space the anti-Semitic representations that accused the Jews of being behind the new government led by Raúl Alfonsín and of the persecution of those responsible for the crimes committed during the military dictatorship. Although the 80s are still a period of little work, the aforementioned investigations allow us to note the continued nature of the anti-Semitic discourse during these years. Although there is still no research to confirm this, we could suggest that until the attacks on the Embassy of Israel in 1992 and the Asociación Mutual Israelita Argentina in 1994, anti-Semitism as public rhetoric and practice of nationalist, Catholic, and conservative groups, it maintained a certain capacity to mobilize sense or precipitate polemics in public space. However, after the attacks, social sensitivity around the representations of the Jew in public space changed. This consideration of the reconfiguration of anti-Semitism after the AMIA bombing would not only be a mere declarative question, but a methodological premise for those of us who investigate the development of Argentinian Jewish life in recent history. Why? A glance at the contemporary scene cannot fail to notice that the integration of Jews in the various dimensions that make up the public sphere has been, in some sense, successful. Unlike the debates and attacks that took place during much of the 20th century, the years we are going through show various personalities with different degrees of self-identification with the Jewish occupying central functions of the institutional, state, cultural, and political fields. The same could be said in relation to the business sphere. For some time now, the question about the persecution or accusations against the Jews has been losing weight. In any case, controversies emerge when the topics put Israel or the Middle East in the center. This shift in meaning is consistent with the impact that the denunciation of anti-Semitism has on the public agenda. Does this mean that there is not anti-Semitism in my country? No, not at all. But it's evident that there is a broad acceptance of an integration of individuals of Jewish origin in various spheres of national endeavor that, at times, cast doubt on the effectiveness of the campaigns to denounce the persecution and hatred of Jewish developed by local community institutions and international organizations. The anti-Semitic expressions that have occurred in the country since the beginning of the 20th century are more like caricatured versions of the interventions and the impact that those same narratives had during much of the 20th century. It seems that anti-Semitism is less a latent threat to the existence of Jewish life in the country, as it could be happening, for example, in some European countries where the situation is worrying, than a resources for intervention and legitimation in the public space, national and in the network of transnational relations of institutions and organizations that have representational aspirations of the Jews. An analysis of the positions of the representative entities of Jews in Argentina could be illustrative of how they seek to preserve or reproduce identity mechanisms that tend to unite a group even against the very victims of anti-Semitism that they propose to confront. In 1919, for example, during the tragic week, Rabbi Alfon from the Israeli Congregation of Argentine Republic warned President Hipólito Yrigoyen that Marxist Jews were elements outside the community. We could point out the same in relation to the military dictatorship and the confrontation established by the Organization of Relative or Jewish Victims of State Terrorism, or, more tragically, the distance, resistance, and opacity of the community leadership to deal with the relatives of the victims of the AMIA bombing. A study of the narratives, practices, and interventions of institutions dedicated to denouncing anti-Semitism should not necessarily conclude that they seek to defend, protect, or represent those affected by anti-Semitism in Argentina. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that really interesting talk, and I think that we'll have an interesting discussion now. So I ask everyone to please submit questions using the Q&A function, and I will get us started. I was wondering if you could start by giving us a sense of the ethnic makeup of Argentina. So how many Jews are there? What percentage of the population is Jewish? And what are the other ethnic groups in Argentina?
Okay, Maurice. Well, that's an interesting point because Argentina has the most the strong community, Jewish community in Latin America. I mean, it's the biggest in a demographic sense, but at the same time, in a symbolic sense too. Why? Because well, we have many Jews in my country, but most of them they are living in the most important cities of Argentina: Buenos Aires, Córdoba, Mendoza, Rosario, La Plata. And so they came to the country during the big migration process in the 19th century, and they integrated, I said, during all the 20th century, and introduced then and the right organizations too the debates about the Jewish question around all the century. So it's an important discussion. It's an important community, but at the same time it's bigger, but it's in proportion. It's not really big. I mean, it's about now to 2,000, yes, 200,000, maybe 250,000, 100,000 Jews. In maybe in the 60s there are more, but I mean it's less than 1% of the population. But at the same time, they have a really, I mean, they are well known as a great community in my country.
Mm-hmm. And how how can you compare the anti-Semitism to prejudice against other immigrant communities in Argentina? So was there also like anti-Italian sentiment in the 20th century, or because they were Catholic, was there less animosity?
No, that's interesting too, because if you saw what happened during the first part of the 20th century, I mean, the first 30 years, this discrimination was put on Jewish, obviously, but at the same time in Italians or some kind of Spain people who get into my country. Why? Because, well, they are Catholic too, but they have different languages, or they use different traditions. So when you saw what happened in the scholarly system, for example, you are going to find, not me, but people that study this situation, this field, they found that the discrimination, it's around all the immigration during the period. But at the same time, this kind of immigration, the Italian, the Spanish immigration, they integrate more easily, more quickly. I don't know is the word, but the Jewish question, the Jewish debate, the polemics around the Jewish continued around all the 20th century. But now I think it's because you said me, well, what happened in the beginning of the 20th century? But I want to say, well, what happened now? Because the discrimination now is not only they doesn't have the Jewish in the center of the debate. They have what happened with other populations that came from countries that are near Argentina, Bolivia, Peru, Paraguay, maybe. So the discriminations continued, but the people that are discriminated are others than the Jews.
Okay, and we're getting a lot of questions from the audience, but I have one more question of my own, yeah, sure. and then I'll come to those. So can you characterize the response of the Jewish community in Argentina to anti-Semitism, and also the nature of the community? Would you say that it's more insular compared to the United States? Like the rates of intermarriage, for instance, are they similar to the United States? Do you know? Or
I remember that more maybe the most important organizations of the Jewish community in my country had the strong policies around the anti-Semitism and historical, the beginning of the Daya, the political representation of the community in my country. It's in relation with the denounce of Nazi fascism during the 30s in the country. But at the same time, they have this, these arms to fight against the anti-Semitism, but at the same time, they have another policies in relation with the continuity of the Judaism in the country. So I remember when I was young, a lot of debates about this kind of marriage and what happened with Judaism, or the debates about what the Jews have to do if they have to live here or go to Israel. These are part of the Jewish community debate. But as Renan Rein said, told, another researcher said, not all the Jewish in my country are integrated to the Jewish institutions. Maybe that's a more it's more similar than what happened in the US.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so question from the audience: can you compare the rate of anti-Semitism today in Argentina to anti-Semitism in other Latin American countries? Is there more anti-Semitism? I mean, there are definitely more Jews in Argentina,
Yeah.
but would you say there's also more anti-Semitism in Argentina compared to other places?
Other places in Latin America.
Latin America, yeah.
Yeah. Well, really, I really didn't know what happened in all the countries of Latin America. You know, Latin America, it's very, very particular. It's very big, and it's very, they have many countries, different countries too. But I think that you're going to find, if you look each country, you're going to find some special characteristic in each one. I mean, Argentina has, like you said, the biggest Jewish community, and the question of anti-Semitism and the Jewish question is they move some sensibility in the public space. But if you look what happened in Chile, when the Palestinian community is very big, yes, the anti-Semitism there maybe it's more strong. I mean, the BDS campaigns in Argentina, really, they didn't have how I can to say they didn't have
it didn't take root there.
Yes, and what happened in Chile is the opposite. Yes, they really they're biggest there. Yeah, and maybe something similar happened. I don't know what happened now in Mexico, but and Brazil it's a different case because, well, you know, now the debates about the Bolsonaro regime and what the position between Bolsonaro and Israel, it's particular. So the situation about anti-Semitism and Israeli, it's very, very special. I think that the science, since this era, this new century, the question of Israel and the Middle East conflict is in the middle of the debate about the anti-Semitism in our countries too. I think that's the same in the US and what happened in Europe too, no?
So another question about the nature of right-wing anti-Semitism in Argentina over the course of the 20th century. This is another comparative question. So is it that different from right-wing anti-Semitism in France, say, or in other countries, or is it part of the same kind of thing, would you say?
No, really, I think that you present a good example because as Daniel Bovich told in his study, the Argentine, the Creole anti-Semitism, it's a kind of copy of French anti-Semitism. I mean, most of the biggest or the first books of anti-Semitism in my country are maybe copies of that Marcel Dumont wrote on France on the final of the 19th century, and then you are going to find some relations between what happened in French and in Argentina too, and I think that this kind of nationalist right wing are maybe in relation as other researchers shows, Ernesto Boslavsky shows that they have some networks, that some international networks that they introduce ideas, books, and they support, I think, the anti-Semitism narratives as part of this of their practices.
Mm-hmm. And okay, so going back to the point you made in the talk about anti-Semitism under the dictatorship, and you know, how there was a large percentage of the disappeared were Jews. Can you just say? Can you elaborate on that? Why was that? Can you say more? Yeah. I felt like that was a key point in your presentation, and I think people are fascinated and would love to hear more.
Yes, that's a very interesting point, and it's very polemic because it's really that if you look what happened with the Jewish Jewish people of Jewish origin in my country during the dictatorship, you are going to find that many 2,000 or 1,500 people of Jewish origin disappear in this period, and the number of disappear are 30,000. But it's like the 5% of the disappearance are Jewish, but not the 5% of the population of Argentina are Jews. So you have there, yes, you have there some problem. I think that we can found two answers for that. The first one maybe is that three answers. The first one is we have anti-Semitism in our country during the 20th century. That's real. First, the second is the people that disappeared in this period are most of them professionals, students, political leaders, and the Jewish are integrated in this status. So the number maybe show the process, the successful process of integration of the Jewish to the national life. Mm-hmm. And third one, maybe the most problematic answer, is that the people that are detained by the policies, forces or the army forces during this period are detained by her political identity, not her ethnic or religious identity. So you're going to find really 1,500 Jewish disappear, 2,000 Jewish disappear. Yes, but they are not in the clandestine centers because they are Jew. They are there because they are part of the left parties or army organizations, the revolutionary army organizations. So we have to understand what is happening during all this period. When I said all this period, is what happened during the 60s, the 70s, and how the youth Jewish integrate to the political life in my country.
Mm-hmm. Okay. This is a kind of difficult question. So can you expand on the different positions taken by the official Argentine Jewish leadership and some American Jewish organizations, such as the B'nai B'rith, during the dictatorship? And do you think that those differences between Argentine and American Jewish organizations persist today in relation to current anti-Semitism?
The question about what happened today, it's more problematic for me because I'm a historian. Yeah. I have all my tools for understand what happened in the past, but really I am very confused in the present, and the present is very hard. I think that the situation between the different responses of the institutional leaders in Argentina and in the US during the dictatorship, it's about the different views or the different possibilities that they have in each context. I mean, I use the quote of Jacobo Timerman because he's a well-known journalist that they was victim of the terrorism, of the state terrorism during this period. But in 1976, they support the dictatorships and they attack the people in the US that they say that here the regime are how I can to say are fighting the human rights in the country, and maybe they saw that because they are looking all the situation during the 60s and the 70s, and what happened in Israel or in the US are that institutional like the Anti-Defamation League, the American Jewish Committee, or maybe other organizations, the Embassy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Israel, try to support, to help people that are suffering human rights violations in my country. I think that that now, I don't know what happened now in the US, but now the Jewish leaderships in my community are involved in political, in political debates. Maybe many of the leaders of the community are now in political parties in my country. So they make more confused the situation about how did use the nouns of anti-Semitism in the present, and really that is a problem. No? That's interesting, because if you saw what happened with the AMIA bombing, you have a lot of organizations of family, of relatives of people who die in the AMIA bombing that are not in relation with the AMIA leadership. So there you have the problem.
Mm-hmm. So to kind of follow up on the bombing, very interesting question that, so that bombing in 1994, someone points out, killed 85 people and is the largest terrorist attack in Argentina.
Yeah.
So does the fact that 27 years later, we still don't know who was responsible, does that reflect anti-Semitism at some level of society?
Oh, in a way, yes, sure. As many researchers shows, the solidarity of the population after the bombing, it's very strong, but at the same time we have to explain what happened with this judicial process that they never finished, and we didn't know who are the author of the bombing, of the attack. That is a kind of anti-Semitism. Yes, really, we can say that. But at the same time, maybe it is it's expression of the ability. I don't know if I mean the opposite of strong, of the institutional democracy in my country. Yeah, because we don't know what happened with the bombing, but we have many processes in relation with this attack. I mean, what happened with the die of the persecutor Nisman, and what happened with and any judicial process are resolved. So maybe these are talking about this label institutional democracy that we have.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. So a question about academia in Argentina. So, we've observed in the United States, there's an increasing presence of BDS and of anti-Israel, anti-Zionist activity on college campuses that a lot of people are very concerned about. Could you just tell us what it's like on campuses in Argentina? Is the BDS movement strong? Do you feel, is there a lot of anti-Zionist pressure right now?
Yes. Oh, well, this is the different situation in Argentina. As I said in the other question about what happened in Chile, maybe. Yeah. I mean, here you are going to have people that support the BDS and have an anti-Zionism narrative or position, but really they are not strong in the country. I think that we have many particular characteristics in Argentina. One is what happened with the AMIA bomb, what happened with the Jewish disappearance during the dictatorships. They build a representation, acceptance by the social, the population about the Jews as a victim of the dictatorship. Then you have the bombing going in Israel embassy, and then in AMIA in 1994. So maybe this kind of practices and narratives and organizations, they are not very strong, and they're marginal now, but they live, they have places here. Maybe when something happens in Middle East, in Israel, between Palestine and other countries in I mean Lebanon or Syria or Egypt, well, the debate introduce introduce or legitimize these positions, but then they move on the margin again, and nothing happens. I mean, I know some colleagues of the US, of the Israel, that they have some problems in Chile for give classes, or the same in Israel and Mexico, but in Argentina that's not happened.
That's interesting because, I think that there's such a strong kind of, traditional leftist presence in Argentina. So that's interesting that the anti-Zionism isn't necessarily part of that yet. Even
one thing more, Argentina is the only one country of Latin America that is part of the International Holocaust Alliance, Remembrance Alliance, the IRA. So they have a strong policies on Holocaust remembrance and commemoration and education. So maybe you have here some interesting points to analyze for understand why BDS or anti-Zionists are not. They exist, but are not really strong.
Interesting. And is there compulsory Holocaust education in public schools in Argentina? Do they learn the Holocaust? Yeah.
We have we have a new law. It's not new because it's about the beginning of the 21st century. But they introduced the human rights as a great a great field in education, and we have some resolutions of the National Ministry of Education that introduce the Holocaust, the learning of Holocaust, the study of Holocaust in the schools. And we have I make it really, I do it. I make the books for the Holocaust for the training teachers on Holocaust studies or Holocaust education. So we have books, we made books, we made some videos, and it's interesting too. Last week we have an activity with Spain, with the Sephard Center of Spain, because the materials that Argentina produced about the Holocaust and genocides during the 20th century are the only ones in Spanish. And as you know, Spanish is a language that we speak in Latin America, but the US now is the second community of Spanish people in Spanish talking hablantes in all the world. So maybe we can use or we can share these books for Spain and for all Latin America.
That's great. So, I think we have been witnessing, and I think this is a trend that's continuing, a kind of depopulation of Jews from from many countries in the world to either the United States and Israel. And if I'm not wrong, I think Argentina is maybe still the fourth or fifth biggest Jewish population in the world. I mean, I think maybe after France and
I think that now is the fifth. The fifth, yes, the fifth bigger population, Jewish population in the world. Yes, yeah. And most of them lives in Buenos Aires. So Buenos Aires it's strange because it's Argentina, but at the same time it's Buenos Aires. And Buenos Aires is like New York, Paris.
Right, that's the case in France too, where the Jewish population of France as a whole is small, as like under 1%. But in Paris, it's actually very big, and that's the capital.
Yes.
So the Jews are. So, but do you? And this is maybe it's hard to forecast the future, but do you see that the community continuing in Argentina, or are we seeing a kind of increase in immigration to Israel or to the United States among Jews in Argentina, or is it? Do you think?
It's interesting. I mean, I have some problems to analyze the present. I said I am historian, but I really it's more difficult to me look what is going to happen in the future. No, but it's interesting because as a colleague, Judith Boxer-Lieberman, a colleague of National University of Mexico, UNAM, it says something interesting, and Sergio de la Pergola of Jerusalem University too. It shows that maybe Jewish life in the 21st century, it's more a process of rediasporization? I mean, are not people that are going just only to Israel? Maybe it's more people are going to the U.S. Not Jewish people in Argentina are thinking that the U.S. it's one of the options, but at the same time maybe are moving all around the world again. I think Jewish community, I think that it's going to continue, yes, really, but at the same that happened in maybe in the US and maybe in Mexico too, or in Chile or in Uruguay, the Jewish life is changing too, because I mean, the process of integration, and now maybe the identification with Israel and with the anti-Semitism that happened now in Europe, it's making some movements in the representations about the self-identification about the Jewishness.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so interesting. So we're about out of time. So I want to really thank you on behalf of the audience who you can't see, but I will clap for everybody here, a kind of virtual clapping, and really say thank you for sharing your expertise and knowledge with us today. We're really, really grateful. And thank you to everyone in the audience for coming. Make sure to look at the YPSA, the Yale Program for the Study of Antisemitism website, sign up for our announcements, for our email list, so you can see what we have. We have a lot of really interesting programming coming up next semester. So I look forward to seeing you all again soon. And thank you again so much, Emmanuel. Okay.
Thank you very much.